Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're viewing this Creative Conference virtual panel. Welcome to the Atlanta Film Festival's Creative Conference. Today, I am super excited to have Chung with us from ITVS. They are documentary funders. They help put things out into the universe. They are, I think, one of the largest documentary funders. But we're going to get all into everything documentaries and documentary funding in a minute. Welcome and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with a little bit about your background. The earliest thing I found on you is that you went to Harvard, but you got a Bachelor of Arts in Government. Is that correct?
That's right. Long time ago. It's been
Yeah,
a
a
while.
long time ago. It's been a while. So, when you were in school, was film a thing? Like, did you grow up with the camera? Were you making movies with your friends? Or were you interested in a kind of a job in government or in teaching? Like, how did that first love come about?
Yeah, I did not study to film or TV production. I didn't even consider it as a career possibility. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. But during my senior year of college, when I had absolutely no idea what I was going to be doing, I found an internship at a local NBC station in Boston, and applied and got the internship for the year. And that was where, for the first time ever, I sat in an edit bay and saw how stories were pieced together, and helped carry equipment and get coffee for people and chase people down the street for man on the street interviews. And so that was really the first exposure I had to film production, TV production. And I had that realization, oh, I can actually do this for work. People do have this dream job as producers and journalists and reporters. And going all the way back, both my older brother and I grew up just devouring TV and film and pop culture. We were born outside of Chicago, and our parents were immigrants from Korea. So Korean was our first language. We spoke it at home and with our grandparents, but it was really movies and TV that were our entry point into American culture. And so I think that's where we really grew up on PBS and a lot of classic comedies like Different Strokes and Happy Days and Saturday Night Live. And again, we just devoured pop culture and media. And I think that love was always there, but it wasn't until that senior year of college where realized that it could be a job.
So when you graduated, is that what you started doing? Did you go into more journalism? Because I saw most of your credits feel like they're in the, documentary or true story kind of space.
Right. Yeah. So when I started looking for jobs as I was about to graduate, my first job out of school was working as an associate producer for a PBS national news analysis program that was based out of DC. So I did that for a couple of years, and that's where I really got my feet wet, learned how to produce and write scripts and interview folks and edit. It was a small company, a 4-person shop, including the host and the executive producer. And so we really learned to do everything soup to nuts. And it was sort of like my own film school in a way. And so that's where I really learned how to actually make programming. And then after that, took a pivot from news programming and went on to produce nonfiction shows. And in those days, it was everything from reality and lifestyle to science programs for primarily basic cable networks like Discovery and National Geographic and TLC, back when TLC was still the Learning Channel. So worked on a variety of programs like that. I worked on Trading Spaces, like home makeover shows, and medical mystery shows, and everything in between, tattoo shows, true crime.
Yeah, and that explains the writing, because I saw that you had a lot of production and exec credits, but I was wondering where the writing came from, and that makes sense coming out of journalism.
Yeah, you sort of have to do it all. And I guess what I realized is whether you're working on a news piece or a reality program, or again, a science program or a doc series, it's the basic skill sets of, interviewing folks, scripting, putting a show together, working with an editor. Those are all fundamental. But then it's really what you go and make with it, what the content is that makes all the difference. But
Yeah.
skill sets were all sort of from that first job working for that PBS series.
Nice. So how did you, I guess, pivot from production to the executive and funding space?
Yeah, so after a while, after producing projects, I became a showrunner, which basically means you're responsible for every episode in a series. And so I did a lot of freelancing for different production companies where they would bring me on to run a series after it's sold. And so at that point was a showrunner and executive producer. And then after a while, started working with companies as part of their team, as part of staff, where I might have a portfolio of different series I'm working on, working with different showrunners. And so bounced back and forth between showrunning and freelancing at some points to being on staff at companies. And then the last few shows I worked on prior to joining ITVS were PBS series, actually. So sort of came full circle working in public media, and then landed this job at ITVS about 5 years ago. And ITVS, we bring documentaries to television through public media. And so it was all like, it felt like all these pieces from my career sort of came together in a dream job with an organization whose mission is meaningful to me.
That's fantastic. And I love that you had all that experience. You know, a lot of people, I think, undervalue kind of the starting as that one-man band where you have to do everything as an independent filmmaker.
Yeah.
But to me, that really gives you that well-rounded education to do a little bit of everything and start to understand everybody's job, so you understand why things cost money, why you need crew, why things take so long, you know? But yeah, that's great. So I guess let's jump into ITVS. Tell us a little bit, I guess, about the program Independent Lens and just kind of the overall scheme of ITVS before we jump into a deep dive.
Sure, definitely. So ITVS is the largest funder and co-producer of documentary films for public media. So we support independent documentary filmmakers. That's actually what the I in ITVS stands for. It's for independent. And the S is for service. And so we're sort of a service organization for independent documentary filmmakers. We seek to bring diverse stories and storytellers into the public media system and to serve underrepresented audiences. And we do that by working with filmmakers, bringing their documentaries and their important stories to the American public for free through public media, primarily PBS. And so the films that we support end up on PBS series such as American Masters or POV, Vocis, and others. We have an in-house series, Independent Lens. It's a PBS series that we produce where each episode is a documentary film. So many of the films that ITVS produces ends up on Independent Lens among these other public media series or other outlets such as the World Channel.
So if I'm an independent filmmaker and I have an idea that I want to pitch that I think is kind of perfect for public media, for PBS, how do I get funding? Walk me through the application process, or how I'm assuming you guys also find people, because I know you hit film festivals probably looking for talent as well. So how does all that happen?
Definitely. Well, so we have a few funding initiatives, but the best way to get our funding and the way in which most of our funding is dispersed is through our open calls, which means that any eligible filmmaker can go on our website and apply. You need to have, some experience. You need to have had something distributed before, but and you do need to be, an American citizen or be able to work in the U.S. But we have these calls in which filmmakers apply with their projects. There's our open call, which is the largest funding initiative. Right now, we're doing it about twice a year, and filmmakers apply in mid-production and beyond. So they need to apply with a treatment and some work sample that's about 15 minutes long that shows, what you've done so far. We do typically need the films to have some sort of funding already. So they're, again, in mid-production or beyond. And then we then come in and hopefully help them finish the film, or at least get through, fill a large portion of their budget gaps. It is, again, twice a year. It's pretty competitive. We have maybe 300 to 400 applications each round. And from that, we're greenlighting about 8 to 10 projects. And that's where the bulk of our funding goes. But we also have a diversity and development fund in which we take about 5 different films every year. And those are in development, so earlier stages, helping folks get to a place where they have a strong treatment and a work sample. We also have a short form open call. We also support short films as well as digital series, and right now vertical video as well. And so a variety of formats, primarily for
Vertical
social media.
video. You mean like TikTok?
Yeah, so we are doing a social media video. We're experimenting with that right now. We haven't done it before in one of our calls, but we're really experimenting with what do docs look like in a vertical format or a social media platform. So we try to be nimble in our short form space to see really where creators and filmmakers are working. So we have that short form open call where we're supporting short works as well. And so those 3 calls are really where the bulk of our funding goes and how really any filmmaker who has experience can apply.
So I'm excited to hear about the shorts because I didn't realize that was an option.
Yeah.
And the vertical experimentation I think is great too. What is the typical time length? Because it's been a while since I've been on the festival circuit, but years ago at Sundance, they had roundtables where you could sit down with distributors and funders. And I had a documentary at the time, and I sat with ITVS, and I remember there was, because it's PBS, there's time limits. So it's not like you can make a 2-hour documentary. I feel like there were time constraints as well. Are there for shorts and for features, or just for, I guess, not even I hesitate to call it feature length, but I guess it is, unless it's programming.
Definitely. So we do have time limits, I should say. So for the open call, which is the feature films or the long form films, we currently have it open to about 30 minutes. The shorts are 30 minutes or longer. So 30-minute broadcast length. And then we have the majority of those films are an hour and a half or hour slots. Sometimes they go to 2. And typically filmmakers are working on their films, which are the feature films, so maybe even longer than that. But once they're accepted into a series, we work with them to cut those down into one of those lengths that would fit into a broadcast slot. But of course, we are also looking at streaming platforms as well, and that's where our films are distributed for public media, both broadcast and on streaming. And so while we are cutting for broadcast length, really our priority right now is for streaming lengths, and there are no time limits on that end. And so sometimes we might have a version that's longer or shorter. But then our short form open call, we're looking for projects that are shorter than 30 minutes. That's why I got confused before, because the short form open call is 30 and under. And then the open call currently has shorts that are 30 minutes or longer. So it can be up to 40 minutes. And then our short form open call, we also have episodic, so web series that can be, let's say about 5 episodes long that are each about 10 to 15 or 20 minutes. But lengths can vary because we are primarily distributing only on streaming platforms for our short content, where again, the time limit is there is no time limit.
That's nice. But I like the idea, that was one of the challenges with my project. There was no way to cut it down, but having watched hundreds of great documentaries and, just in 1 year of screening for someone, the hardest thing for me screening for someone is like, I see the ideas there, but I could tell they got lost in the edit. And having been a filmmaker that got lost in the edit, like I want to reach out and go, I can fix your movie, just make these cuts. And, so I mean, sometimes it's really helpful to have that limitation because you're creating a tighter, more cohesive story and more impactful story.
Definitely. And we're again pretty flexible in terms of working with the filmmakers on what their goals are. And so again, we understand that for most of our filmmakers who are working on feature films, like they're first and foremost looking to premiere at, let's say, a festival if they can get into one. And so that length might be different, and that might be their first goal. But then we're working with them, of course, to then create the TV version of that film. But we support. Again, we're the S is for service, and we're here to support the filmmakers in all of their goals. I should note the other sort of unique way in which we operate, and that reminded me of it, is that we don't take the copyright. The filmmaker, when they work with us, retain their copyright and ownership of their program, and they also, therefore, also have editorial control. And so we are, again, supporting their vision. We are giving them notes. We're trying to make their cut stronger, of course, but we want them to maintain that editorial control and be sort of unencumbered by outside influences. And so that's another unique way in which we work.
Yeah, that is very unique. And I love the flexibility and all the options, you
Yep.
know, I mean, you've really opened things up to all the ways in which people tell true stories.
Right.
What is this, what is the typical budget size, or I shouldn't say budget size. What is the typical funding size? I assume that you have caps on that, or, you know, what is the kind of the general amount of money that you are funding?
Sure. For long form projects, typically we're giving around the $350,000 range. Sometimes, give or take, depending on the budget, but that's the typical funding amount for a film that goes through our open call. And, that might be, of course, it depends on the size of the filmmaker's budget, but it can be sometimes half of a filmmaker's budget, or a third, or a quarter. And again, typically the filmmakers will have already raised quite amount of a bulk of money. And so we're not always finishing funds, but we try to get them through the hump of production, and then they might be continuing to fundraise as they work with us.
Excellent. So what are some of the titles that people might have seen that are coming out of PBS?
Sure. So let's see, so many to count. We fund and co-produce maybe about 40 to 50 titles a year, and we've been around for like roughly 30 or so. So, I think can safely say that we funded, more than 1,000 projects at this point, from, again, short form to features to doc series. Just off the top of my head, like I Am Not Your Negro, Raoul Peck's Oscar-nominated film about James Baldwin, is one. We've had quite a few Oscar-nominated films in the last few years, including Bing Liu's Minding the Gap, and Ramal Ross's Hale County This Evening. We funded and supported Stanley Nelson on a bunch of his projects, including Black Panthers. We also do docuseries, I should mention, and we had one a few years ago called Philly DA by Ted Passon and Yoni Brook, which I just thought was a brilliant docuseries about the Philadelphia DA. So yeah, the list goes on and on, but we are really proud of the work that our filmmakers do and that we're able to support.
One of the things that popped into my head when you were talking about the development fund, so the Diversity Development Fund, how involved do you guys get with that development? Are you working kind of, do you assign someone from ITVS to kind of work with them one-on-one for development? Is it like a development lab? Are you there just to kind of support what they need and help guide what they need? How does that program work?
Sure. Well, so for all of our projects, whether they're in development or in production, we assign a staff member, either a supervising producer or a consulting producer, or sometimes both, on those projects. And so they are working definitely one-on-one, or sometimes two-on-one, with their projects when working with ITVS. And specifically for the Diversity Development Fellowship, they are definitely getting a consulting producer with whom they're working throughout their journey. And then also there's a cohort of filmmakers. So again, we might be accepting 5 filmmakers in one round. They're also getting to meet each other and build relationships, hear about each project, go on a little retreat together, and then work together with their consulting producer for a period of anywhere from 6 months to sometimes a year and a half, just depending on how much the project needs.
Right. So I'm kind of jumping around, which I don't mean to, but going back to the application process,
Sure.
what are some kind of best practices? Because is this kind of like writing a grant in a sense? You did mention some of the things, but like grant writing is an art in itself. Like what are
Yeah,
some best
definitely.
practices? And then maybe we'll get into some common mistakes you see filmmakers make as well. I know one of the things you mentioned is they needed to have distribution in the past. So they need to basically, when they're coming to you, they need to have some sort of track record of success.
That's right. And it's just one project that needs to have been distributed and not self-distributed. And so again, that can mean working with a commercial network or PBS before or a journalism outlet. So there are a variety of ways that you can meet that eligibility criteria, but it is like writing a grant in terms of that proposal. We're always looking for a proposal as well as a work sample when you get to the production stage. And it is not like a TV deck, which might be, glossy, but not have all the details. We are looking for a pretty hefty and thoughtful treatment. And we ask for a lot of different things within that treatment. We're definitely considering the filmmaker and their connection to the story. So we want the filmmaker to be able to really explain, why do you want to tell the story? Why are you the right person to tell it? Why are you passionate about it? We consider filmmaker practices, especially when the communities or the participants who are in the film are vulnerable. It's not just about how do you get a great story out of them, but it's also about how are you working with them? How are you honoring their stories? How are you treating them, respecting them? What are the power dynamics at play and how are you addressing them? Are there mental health issues that you need to be able to support when asking them to share their stories? So
I
filmmaker
love
practice.
that piece. Yeah, that's so important. There's a couple of reality shows that wanted me to get involved with them, and the ethics of how they were getting that story and how they were dealing with these people, I had serious concerns with. And I think that's really, obviously that comes from a lot of, reality TV background. But I think that is super important. And, what does that look like? I mean, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations, it's not just the ethic. There's a lot that goes into being thoughtful in that. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is so important and what that looks like in practice?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll start with there's a group called DAWG, DAWG, the Documentary Accountability Working Group. And we have a couple of people on staff who've actually are part of the group and have worked with them. But it was a small group that came together, I think, pretty soon after the reckoning or and during the pandemic to really consider filmmaker practices and working with participants. And they put out this amazing document. It's I think they call it their framework of different things to consider when working with, again, your participants in a film. And so I really point people to that resource. Again, it's the Documentary Accountability Working Group's framework. And it asks a lot of thoughtful questions. It's not a one size fits all by any means. And we at ITVS, we don't look at that and say, okay, everyone follow this, but they ask a series of questions and give a series of examples of how power dynamics can come into play, or really asking folks to think about their values and their ethics, as well as authorship of a program. And so, again, just a few examples might be, how are you taking care of your participants if you are asking them to relive their trauma? Are you providing mental health resources on set? How are you thinking about their safety? That's one. Again, authorship is another. Are you just helicoptering in and telling a story that you really don't have a connection to? Or how involved is the community in telling their own story? Do you have anyone on your team who might be from the community, for example? And again, these are not hard and fast rules, but certain films might lend themselves to needing this more than others. Another, which is again sort of a gray area, and I know there's a lot of debate around it, is do you pay participants? What happens when there are participants who are missing work or or spending a lot of time working with you, almost as a producer, getting all their resources and digging up archival and reaching out to everyone in their lives. Again, these are not steadfast rules on our end, but there are things that folks are starting to consider and are very controversial, I would say. There's also the issue of,
That makes me think of, if you're doing a documentary on someone, and sadly, documentaries aren't rolling in dough. Nobody's getting rich
Sure.
making documentaries. But if a documentary was to recoup its proceeds,
Yep.
would that documentary subject be a part of that success, that financial success? That I can, and just paying, I can see why that's controversial, because when you pay someone, that changes the dynamic as well,
Exactly. Yeah. So those are all the great questions that have come up.
Yeah.
As some of these questions have prompted them. And again, for us, it's not you definitely should do this or you shouldn't do this. It's a conversation, and it depends on the film. Obviously, there are different power dynamics at play when you're producing a film. If you're producing a film with a politician, it's different from someone who might be formerly incarcerated and are returning citizens. And so those are the type of questions that we want our filmmakers to be thinking about. There's also the issue of consent. What does it mean where someone signs a release, 5, 10, 15 years ago, and what does it mean to then have the film released, years later? And some folks are recommending ongoing consent. Some filmmakers will even ask for consent, until they're at picture lock. And then, the traditional practice has been, got the signed release, we're good to go. And so questions like that, again, having to do with safety, health concerns, just people having control of how their stories are told as well, which
and I think the release thing is important. I shot a documentary, and I was dealing with a lot of people who I had to make the assumption might not be able to read or understand the contract.
Yeah.
Because they were very quick to sign. And I, as a producer, was like, no, please read it. And they're like, no, I trust you. I said, well, why don't I tell you what is in this contract so you fully understand it? Because I know sometimes legalese, having sat on a lot of really expensive legal calls, where you put a comma or a period or the language you use greatly influences what that means. And I think there's a lot of people who don't have a lawyer, can't afford that lawyer, and how are they really giving consent if they don't even understand what the contract says?
Yeah, definitely.
Documentaries lead to a lot more thoughtfulness, hopefully, than a lot of narrative projects, just because of the stories and the people.
Yeah, and again, I would say that's like the very basics, right? Just making sure that people are understanding what they're getting into in the first place. But then again, what happens years later when their circumstances may have changed.
That gets ongoing trickiness. Wow.
Yeah. And again, it's not something that we are saying you definitely need to do. And we have our own, discussions and healthy discussions around all of this, and none of it is policy. But it is what we are definitely seeing the trend in filmmakers, both asking these questions and implementing some of the practices. Another one is just showing your participants cuts of the film, which, some filmmakers are like, never, I would never do that. They should not be able to see it until it airs or it premieres. And then others are, I show them every step of the way, and then also value their input, which again, it's very polarizing, I should say.
Oh yeah. Well, and it really does depend on the project. Some projects make sense to do that and others may not. When it comes to mistakes, what are some of the common mistakes that you see in applications that you're like, obviously following directions. So that's always the big one. A lot of people don't follow directions because they think they can be the exception. But, are there a series of missteps that you see quite often?
Yeah, I would say sometimes it's clear that folks don't know who we are as Independent Lens and or ITVS, and going to public media or where it can be distributed. And so if folks, there are folks who might write, we want to work with such and such streamer on our project. It's like, well, that is not what we do. And in many cases, that's incompatible with what we do. And so just number one, just knowing who we are and our goals in public media. But I think one of the things, it's not necessarily a mistake, but just a piece of advice might be that we have a process in which we are really just looking at the application. We're not interviewing or speaking with the filmmakers in the various rounds of review. That's to be fair, and that's not to be influenced by how someone performs, or someone might speak better than someone else. And so it's really a process in which we're not working with the filmmakers in that way. And so we're really relying, again, on the work sample and the treatment to speak for the filmmaker. And so I would say just put everything in there. Don't leave room for assumptions where the reviewer might have to say, the filmmaker didn't really talk about X, Y, or Z, or their filmmaking practices, or what their plan is. And so the reviewer has to sort of fill in the gaps of what they think that the intention is. Whereas my advice would be, don't leave room for reviewers to assume what your intentions are. Put everything in the kitchen sink in there of what your vision is, and why you want to tell this story. So that's one, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's important because a lot of filmmakers, if they don't work in the documentary or journalism space, are used to kind of holding the cards a little bit. It's like, here's what it is, and I want you to want more, so they just tell you just enough to get you interested, but not everything. And they forget that, like, okay, if I'm going to fund you, I want to know the whole story. Like and then chaos ensues. Well, what is the
Right.
chaos? Like, what is that? And
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
very important for them to realize you do need to put all your cards on the table, because that's the only way to get them interested.
Yeah. I definitely, I would say everything from the story and where you might see the narrative arc going to your shooting style. Do you have any a specific vision for how you're going to shoot it? What if you're doing animation? What is that animation style? Sometimes folks leave those things pretty vague, but we are also definitely considering the style of the film and innovation. We're looking for innovation and innovative ways of storytelling, and so we want to hear about it. We don't want to have vague. We're going to use animation here. That's not enough to really sell what the vision is for the director.
I know that one of the things you are looking for is underrepresented stories. What are some of the other things that you think ITVS is best known for, or you're most attracted to? Are there certain kinds of projects that we're like, yes, we love these? Are there other projects that you're like, oh, we've seen these 1,000 times, even though maybe this is a new way to tell it? Like, are there certain, I guess, genres or topics that are more interesting than not?
Sure. I would say from a content perspective, it can really run the gamut what the story's about. But we are looking again for sort of untold stories. What are stories that are not out there? If you've already seen 5 different, films on that same person, for example, then it doesn't mean we won't tell it, but it's like, why is this one different? Who is the filmmaker? What is their perspective that is so different? So there's nothing we necessarily avoid, I would say, but we are always looking for the film to spark conversation. And so it's not just that was a fun movie to watch, but really what is the discussion that flows afterwards? Is there some sort of social impact? And not everything has to be a quote unquote social issue doc, but I think we are looking for, again, conversation and the PBS mission of education as well.
And I'm going to get into that. I want to write down education because I have questions for the distribution section on that, and I don't want to forget.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the production process a little bit. What does that look like when you guys are involved, and how involved are you in that process?
Sure. So we are co-producers when it comes to films that are coming to us for production funding. And so, and what we mean by that is we are supporting the independent filmmaker and their teams. So they are the ones who are out in the field with their participants. They're the ones in the edit bay, wherever they are across the country. We are not there with them physically, but we're supporting them, and we're working with them on everything from budgeting to legal issues to editorial. Of course, we're giving notes on cuts and working with them on their story. And so everything from a production standpoint, any type of support we can give from our offices in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we are doing so. And the funding we give is actually production licensing dollars. So that's how we consider those funds. So they're, of course, being used for the filmmaker's production budget, but sort of the exchange that happens is we get our funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds PBS and NPR. It's ultimately taxpayer dollars flowing to them and then to us. And so the exchange is we fund our filmmakers with that money, and then the filmmakers give us their license rights for public media, so that the American public, whose money it is, ultimately gets to see the film for free for first. They see the premiere, and so our funds are considered licensing dollars, but we are giving them both production money as well as production support through the services I mentioned.
Yeah. And I assume that a lot of the funding probably does go for post-production. I guess it depends on obviously the type. If there's a lot of research and it's heavy into, historical topics, but I just remember how much footage I had,
Yeah.
and I still have a documentary that I shot 5 years ago that I haven't cut together because it's so much footage. I don't even, it's me. Like, I wanted to do this one on my own, and there's so much footage, how, I just, remember like calling my narrative filmmakers, because that's where I came from. My director's going, I now know why you called me on the ledge. Like, I'm on the ledge. Talk me off.
Yeah.
How do you guys help filmmake, the post-production process when you're dealing with a documentary? There is so much footage. Like, there's so many different ways a story can flow. How do you help folks really, identify, like, keep your head straight, this is your goal. This is your goal. Keep that in mind, because I would imagine that's got to be one of the hardest challenges for your team, is shepherding post-production.
Yes.
Maybe not, you tell me.
Yeah. Yes, and that's often the stage at which films come to us, but sometimes they're still shooting as well. And so in terms of the bulk of our funding, it can go through to production. It can be, again, just depends on the type of film it is. It can be that they really just need finishing funds for animation, or perhaps it is a heavy archive film and they just don't have enough. So the filmmakers use the funds in a lot of different ways, but I think in terms of the support they need in post-production, again, we're not there in the edit with them. We're not looking through, hours and hours of raw footage, but we are able to provide sort of that story consultant support in helping just work on what is the narrative of the film, or the structure, or do they need to pivot, and is it really the 2-3 characters that they thought were going to be in the film, but it's really one that it's going to eventually be about. We've seen a lot of pivots like that. And so again, we're not necessarily able to be there going minute by minute through everything, but I think it's really about being a sounding board, or like those calls that you've made out to your friends and support. We're sort of like that same, those lifeline calls.
And you brought up the pivot, and that was where I was going to head next. I assume that happens quite often because, unless you're telling the true story of a war photographer, there might be some surprises that come up, but you pretty much know who those core people are. You might identify some new people to invite into the story, but a lot of times you're finding the story as you go. So you think the
Definitely.
path is taking you in this direction, but it really takes you in this direction. And you do have to kind of kill characters that are part of the true story.
Yeah.
Um, how often do you find that's the case? And how do the filmmakers and ITVS kind of navigate those changes?
Yeah, definitely. It certainly happens a lot, and I think that's just the nature of our business. You can uh, plan for, and as producers, you can plan for everything to go right, and then
Often
and then
does.
be ready to pivot, and that the same goes for story, of course. And I think that's also some of the beauty of what we do, where you might have in your mind at the beginning of a project, or a filmmaker might have their vision for what the film is, and then it takes a ton of left turns, and you find something even more beautiful. And so I think you just have to be ready for that, and it happens all the time. And we as ITVS are supportive of that, because we understand what it means to work with real people, and that you're not dealing with actors on a script that you've planned already. It's really letting them lead, and the story might go a completely different direction. So we're supportive of that, because we know that's just the nature of the beast. I can just think of a film that we just had premiere at South by Southwest that went through that. We greenlit it pre-pandemic, and it was supposed to be one type of film. And through the course of those 5 years, the filmmaker and the filmmaking team just had different revelations. And it turned out to be a very different film than what was originally pitched to us. A lot of the same, if you read a log line, it might
Yeah.
be similar, but the idea, the structure, the artistic vision, everything changed, and I think it's so much stronger for it. It's a beautiful film, and they've just really, in the course of those 5 years, working with the community and the participants, they found a different film that is great.
And I love that you use the term beautiful twice, but talking about how those changes really led to something beautiful. And we've got another in-person panel that is improv. Last year we did, improv for creativity, but this year we're doing improv for producers, learning how to pivot,
Yeah.
because everything always goes wrong.
Yep.
And as soon as you think you figured out how to make a movie, you learn all kinds of new things on the next one that you didn't expect. And a lot of times I call them happy accidents. You run
Yes.
into something that does create something better, and being open to that as a filmmaker is so important, because this is my film and this is the story I'm going to tell. And if you're too rigid in that idea, sometimes you don't allow those happy accidents to lead you to that more beautiful space.
Definitely. I would say that's one of the things that I had to learn early on as a producer director, where, on one hand, some of the best producers and directors I know are very type A and have everything planned out, and you sort of need that strong plan. But then that sort of level of focus and rigidity can lead to not being able to then again see what else is out there, and go with the flow when something reveals itself. And so being able to shift and throw it all out the window, and say, hey, this is even better, or it's raining. What else can we do? Or someone just dropped out, and it's not always happy accidents. Sometimes it's just bad circumstances. But then how do you pivot? How do you the stronger producers and directors that I've worked with know how to make lemonade. I've
Yeah.
just used like 10 different analogies, but
They all made sense
yeah,
though, so
right.
that's fine. Um, so I love that they retain the copyright and editorial control. And we talked about that earlier, but I think that is something that is rare in the filmmaking world. Can you talk a little bit more about why ITVS chose that path? And you've worked for plenty of streaming services and networks and other people who kept the copyrights on those things. So why is that something that you've made? I guess it comes down to the licensing agreement, and that's how that works. But why was that something that was so important to ITVS as an organization?
Yeah, again, the way we work and the reason we are, we exist is to support the independent filmmaker. Again, who's not, working for a big corporation or production company. And we can get into streaming and what consolidation has done to the industry, but I think it's so important for those independent voices from communities who don't necessarily have their stories told, get to tell their own stories and aren't told, at the end of the day, what their editorial should be. And so our mission is to support and protect that voice, and to bring that to public media. And that's also how PBS often works as well. There are folks, of course, on their teams working on editorial, both at the national and local level, but it's often the works are from independent voices who are bringing those stories to public media. So that's just sort of the model in general.
Yeah. So when it comes to the distribution, obviously you talked about the premiere being on public media, but a lot of these things are going to film festivals. What are some of, how long does this license last? And, how much latitude is there for these projects to go onto a stream? So maybe it premieres with you, maybe it goes onto a film festival. Can it be picked up from a film festival on for a streaming network or a television or cable network? I guess cable network is the wrong word these days. I'm dating.
Yeah. So first of all, we support film festival premieres, and those are often the actual premieres. So when I say that the public media premiere is first and foremost, that's for television, or what I guess are now calling television. But we do allow for the world premiere to be film festivals because we know how important those are for filmmakers, both for other distribution or sales opportunities, and to support the film community at large. And so those are often the first premieres, and we allow for that. And then some filmmakers also do theatrical. Our licensing agreement, again, is primarily for the U.S. audience. That is who we are exhibiting for. And so filmmakers are able to, first of all, do international sales and have international distribution as well. We are looking at terms of roughly 3 or 4 years. It just depends on which program we're talking about or which series. But for our long form films, it's from 3 or 4 years. And most of that time period is exclusive, meaning it lives on PBS or another public media entity. But we do have filmmakers who are able to work with us to get other deals. So they are going off and doing educational sales. I mentioned international. They are doing engagement screenings and impact. They're doing speaking engagements with their films. And some are able to get other streaming deals as well, as long as they don't interfere with our premiere. So there are filmmakers who might get a fast channel or AVOD deal, oftentimes working with us. We are partnering with PBS and PBS Distribution, which is their for-profit wing that finds these commercial deals. And so we might work with them to then get our filmmakers an AVOD or fast deal as well. So there are different ways that the filmmaker can continue to generate revenue and have their films distributed outside of public media, as long as they don't conflict with our mission of serving the American public and letting them see this content for free first.
Yeah. So, and you totally you keep answering the questions that I have next. So on the education side, that was one of the things I was curious about, because a lot of social action or a lot of political things, which I know you have a background in as well. You worked on political campaigns. You know, a lot of them do like an educational college circuit. So you play the film, you have a discussion on domestic violence, you know, and you bring mental health and you know, different people together. Does ITVS help with all of those things, or is that a completely separate market that the filmmaker is doing? Because it feels like it's right up a PBS alley.
Yeah, great question. Well, we do have for Independent Lens an engagement screening program called Indie Lens Pop-Up, in which we work with hundreds of local organizations, including PBS stations around the country for a number of films that are going to be on that season of Independent Lens. Roughly about 5 or 6 programs a year do the Indie Lens Pop-Up program. So that film will be screened, or a shorter version of it, in the local community, and then there's discussion around it. And those community organizations are often bringing in other experts or organizations to those screenings to discuss the film. But in terms of a larger, you know, engagement and more of the advocacy realm, we do not do that. In fact, we are looking for projects that are not supported by advocacy organizations. If there's an advocacy or activist who's giving money to a film because they have a certain agenda around the film's topic, we actually can't support it. And that's part of PBS's standards and practices of making sure that this the editorial content is, again, sort of unencumbered by advocacy work. Now, that doesn't mean that.
Sorry to interrupt. Is that advocacy just financial? Like, because some people build partnerships,
Yeah.
you know, and it's not funds. It's just like, hey, we're the Leukemia Society, and you know, we support this film and this person who has leukemia that you're doing a film about. But they have no control. They have no finance. Those are, you know, they're completely separate. Is something like that okay, or is it just a financial support?
Yeah, so I mean, we get pretty specific about what sort of support it is. If it's support for editorial, for example, we can't have that, of course. There's influence there on the content. If it's financial support, then, you know, that we don't allow either, because you know, money never comes for free in terms of production. But if it's support for, let's say, engagement afterwards, that's the sort of thing that the filmmaker can do separately, where they can partner with organizations who say, hey, we love your film and we think we can use this in, you know, for outreach. That happens without us. And again, it can't have any impact on the content and the financing for the production. So I guess that's the piece where they do work with different organizations. But just from the editorial and funding perspective, for example, and these are probably the most egregious types that that I don't think anyone would bother applying with this. But let's say if a film on gun control is funded by the NRA, or about abortion rights is funded by Planned Parenthood. It's just, there's obviously a conflict of interest there, and the editorial, you know, it just that trust that we have with the American public, which PBS is known for, that just would be broken. And so that's or even even the appearance of having a conflict is problematic. So
when it comes to, you know, the doc landscape has changed quite a bit, you know, and especially due to streaming, and who knows what's happening to it. They've all eaten themselves. Like, let's create a network to compete with our network, and let's all do it. You know, it's unsustainable. So it'll be very interesting to see how that changes things. How has, you know, the disruption of how we consume media changed in the documentary world?
Yeah, I mean,
that's probably a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, we could do this for another 3 hours, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I think it's just been streaming has been incredibly disruptive, and disruption can be both good and bad. Of course, I would say a lot of the tech industries that are doing the disruption would use it as a positive thing to say that they're
The rest of
disruptors.
us are longing for cable again, and we
Right?
never
Yeah,
thought we'd say that. Like, bring back
and
cable.
well, it's sort of, and it looks like some of that might come back in a different form. A lot of these channels that we're talking about, like the fast channels, seem to be sort of that old cable model. So we'll see what continues to happen. But yeah, it's been incredibly disruptive. First and foremost, just how we all view and consume media is different from what it was 10 years ago with streaming. And even we mentioned vertical video before and social, where people are swiping as they watch something more often than even sitting on a couch and watching your TV. So the audience viewership trends have changed. Broadcast is certainly dying out slowly, and the streaming audiences have surpassed broadcast. And then the streamers in general, I think, just specifically for docs, I think that the opportunities that were there a few years back for doc filmmakers to have more distribution partners has dwindled, unfortunately. There was a period, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, where people were actually saying it was the golden age of documentaries, and that was because these streaming services had a different model where they were saying we need as much content as possible, and they were buying up everything just in those early days of the streaming wars, a race to gobble up as much content. And that was a great time for doc filmmakers, where a lot of projects were being sold and bought. And then I would say the last couple of years, what we've seen is that model changing. First of all, the streamers consolidating, and so what used to be more streaming services just ending up being a handful, and in doing so, the streamers buying less content, and also having a certain strategy of, we're going to support just a specific type of content that we think will just have the widest audience as possible. And for documentary, that's ended up being a lot of celebrity-driven documentaries, sports and music, food, and true crime.
True crime. Yeah, true crime just seems to have exploded.
Yeah. And so those buckets have really been where the bulk of the money has gone, it seems to be. And then beyond that, there may be 1 or 2 docs a year that a streaming service might pick up. That's more of a social issue or type doc, because that's their Oscar play. And so they're picking that 1 or 2 film from one of the film festivals to say, this is the one where we're going to put in all of our marketing dollars and support. And so again, for our doc filmmakers, we've seen fewer opportunities to sell their films. Even the ones that make it to top film festivals aren't necessarily getting deals out of it. And then for those who, that was never the intent to try to make a lot of money, but at least get some distribution, they're needing to look for other opportunities and angles. And I think, the positive note for us and at ITVS and public media is that we're seeing a lot of filmmakers come back to us and say, hey, you've always been there supporting this work. Yeah, we see that you're consistent and constant, and how can we work with you again? That's good for us, but at the end of the day, the fact that there are fewer opportunities in general for filmmakers is not good, because a rising tide lifts all boats, and we want our filmmakers to have a healthy, sustainable industry, and whether that means working with us or also being able to go out there and make a lot of money on other deals. That's good for all of us. So yeah, it's been tough, I think, all around.
Yeah.
And theaters aren't doing well. And so, even the theatrical runs that filmmakers used to have are not as robust. And also film festivals, a lot of, we're seeing some film festivals fail or really limit how many films they're bringing in a year. And so all around, it seems to be the industry is contracting.
And, the last you know, COVID was the heyday because
Yeah.
everybody was home consuming media. But to me, it felt like none of these institutions were thinking about what happens when we come out of COVID, because we're going to. And all, you know, it's like their short-term game, like it makes me feel like nobody's thinking about the long game, just like all of I guess the corporatization of everything.
Mhm.
It's all about short-term game and what we can make now, and nobody's thinking about the long haul,
Yeah,
because the economic challenges just for independent filmmakers are difficult. You know, the
for
studio
sure.
model is we're not going to support the 3 to 5. We don't make 3, 5, 10, $20 million movies anymore. Everything has to be a tent pole.
Right.
Everything, you know, so just as a filmmaker making independent content in general, it's challenging, let
Yeah,
alone all of the additional things on top of, you know, that for documentary filmmakers.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously the entire industry has been media and entertainment industry has been disrupted, which is why we had like all the
Strikes.
strikes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
Uh,
that goes back to funding,
yep.
because as a film festival, you rely on two things, depending on where you're located. You rely on the community who loves films, but really they're people who are passionate about film. They might come from corporate America, but if they're not spending a lot of money on advertising because they're not sure where things are going, like commercials slowed down, even though they weren't
Yeah.
affected by the strikes, we saw commercial world slow down.
Yep.
So those people aren't giving, corporations aren't giving, even though they're making record profits, you know,
Yeah.
blaming it on inflation, but they're just getting
Right.
richer. Sorry to turn
Yeah.
this into a
Yeah.
you know, but all of these things are like, that's why a lot of film festivals are failing, because they're not getting corporate sponsors and they're not getting the individual sponsors.
Right.
So all of these things are affecting everything. And I think people don't realize how intricately connected they really all are.
That's right. Yeah, definitely. And at the end of the day, for these, you know, these commercial streamers, it's really about the bottom line and how to make their investors happy. That's their fiduciary duty.
Yeah.
And so that, yeah, it affects everything and everyone. But as we were talking about earlier, that model still hasn't stabilized, and we're continuing to see changes every year. There's still all of those streamers are trying to figure out what actually works. You know, this year we're seeing a lot more ads than
Yes.
than ever before on those platforms. And you know, again, it's that question of will we eventually end up with what feels like, you know, basic cable again, or what is the model that's actually going to make you know, again, them happy and also work for the audience as well as filmmakers. But you said something else, which was during the pandemic and COVID, and that time where it looked a little bit, it was less bleak for filmmakers. And the other thing that happened during that time was the reckoning. And you know, after the murder of George Floyd, and that was also a time when a lot of, well, everyone, but including these commercial entities were asking, how can we do better? And they actually had more, let's say, more of focus on serving different audiences and bringing more diverse content to their field, supporting filmmakers from diverse backgrounds. And so there was actually a period where, again, it seemed to be more hopeful in terms of the content and the film community from that lens as well. And unfortunately, I think what we've seen is that commitment having having, I don't want to say completely gone away, but certainly not to what we thought it may be during that time in 2020 and 2021. And so like last year, I think there were like 5 or 6 DEI officers at some of these top commercial streamers who left either on their because they felt like it wasn't working, or they were fired. And so again, we're seeing, and we talked about the type of content again that they're focusing on now, and a very narrow focus on celebrity, music, true crime, food. And so I think from a content and just a representation perspective, that's also shifted from what it was a few years back,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Again, you answering my next question. I was going to ask you how the pushback on DEI is affecting. Now, does the pushback on DEI in the kind of corporate world or the funding world affect you, because that is one of your missions? Have you found that, the companies that might have been in support of this are in less financial support now? Are you seeing that as kind of not just in the world of pushback, but physically or, financially feeling that difference?
Yeah, well, I would say that from the commercial streamers, at a certain point a few years back, it was almost more of a competition where we were the films that we always have been supporting. There was actually more interest in those from commercial streamers, and they were shelling out millions of dollars for those films, and we can't do that. And so we had filmmakers who were actually saying, I'm going to go take that deal with that commercial streamer. And again, that was for us. It was, we would have loved to have had that film for the public audience, but now they're going off with that streamer. But that was, again, actually a good thing, I think, in general, because it meant that that content, those filmmakers were being able to sustain their careers and get paid, and they should. We need better ways of funding and supporting our artists. And oftentimes they would still come back and work with us, and they were able to because they made that multi-million deal, and they could support their next 2 or 3 films. And so from that perspective, when the streamers were supporting that content, it was a little bit of more competition, but now we're seeing less of that intersection of the content we're supporting and looking for and the content they're supporting, which means, again, less competition in that sense of the word. But that's not necessarily something we see as a positive, because at the end of the day, we want this type of content to be supported all around, because we think it's important, and whether it's with us or with a commercial streamer, something that's having an impact and educating audiences around these issues is part of our mission.
This is kind of out of left field, but I've seen this trend in the last 5 to 6 years. I mean, it's been around a little bit longer, but podcasting, there's a lot of IP for films coming out of podcasting. A friend of mine pitched an idea to me that was a true story, true crime, believe it or not. But he had written a narrative feature about this true event, and, it'd be written in kind of like a buddy comedy. It had been out in Hollywood, had been optioned a bunch of times, always got trapped in turnaround. And he kept the documentary rights because we wanted to tell the true story.
Yeah.
And he basically pitched to iHeartRadio a podcast, got an 8-episode podcast put out for the 50th anniversary of this story, and kind of got with that producer and said, hey, I know the film fell apart, but would you be willing to lend your name to this podcast for the 50th anniversary, just to kind of, raise the profile a little bit? We'll give you an executive producer credit. And they did. And now that feature film is being made in Georgia right now. And it's an amazing story. Like, we never had the money to be able to pull it off independently. I mean, it had to be made. It was just a huge film.
Yeah.
But I've been talking about, all these filmmakers, and, just like comics are going to film, a lot of filmmakers have turned to podcasting to tell these stories as kind of, I guess, a different type of proof of concept. And that is where Hollywood is finding IP. Is this something that ITVS has thought about or experimented with the past that I may just ignorantly not know about? Or is it something you guys have talked about, like with your vertical ideas?
Yeah, we've talked about, is there a podcast opportunity for us? But we haven't really done anything in that space yet. And I think the reason why is because, the content is coming to us from the filmmakers. We're not generating our own ideas. Filmmakers are bringing us their great ideas, the stories that they've been seeking to tell. And so some of them might go and look for multimedia opportunities, but it's not something that we've partnered with them on right now. But we are looking for multi-platform opportunities in general. So we're working with filmmakers, if they have a feature film, to perhaps then create a short digital series around it, or a series of social media marketing pushes that feel authentic to Instagram or YouTube Shorts. And so we are experimenting in that multi-platform space, just because that's the future. And we know that audiences are not necessarily finding films through commercials on TV. They're finding it on TikTok or Instagram. But yeah, we haven't done I don't believe we've done anything in the podcast space, not at least not as long as I've been at ITVS for the last 5 years.
Got it. Oh no, it was just in my head. You said something that triggered another question. Not multi-platform, although I love that idea because it's true. You know, I'll see little clips on TikTok or on social media platforms, and I'll go Google what is that thing because I found it to be interesting, and then I want to go consume that.
Yeah,
Oh, I
I
know what
think,
it was. Marketing on the distribution side. So when, you know, that's another big thing. Obviously, you have your, you know, the trailers that are cut. There's probably, you know, posters for the filmmakers when they go on the festival circuit. How much input or how much assistance are you guys giving in the development stage with the marketing and distribution of everything?
sure, not so much at the development stage, but I think most of the marketing and that we do is for certainly film premieres, and a lot of it is also with Independent Lenses series or the specific series that are more audience facing. So, you know, our films might go to American Masters, and then American Masters, a series, has their own marketing team. Independent Lens is our own internal series, and so we have marketing for that. So most of the marketing for specific films are done with the PBS or public media series involved and those teams, rather than just holistically doing marketing for every single film in the same way. But we are providing that support in the later stages as the films are then attached to a public media series.
Excellent. Trying to think if there's anything I've missed. I'm going to look at my notes really quick.
Sure.
I feel like we've covered a lot of great ground. Is there anything that I'm missing that I haven't asked about that you'd like to talk about?
Let's see. I mean, I'd just love to hear more about the festival, but I know that this may be watched
Oh,
after the festival, so we can offline about that. But
um, well, much like PBS, we take diversity very seriously, and we generally have over 50% being filmmakers of color, over 50% being filmmakers that identify as female. And I try to do the same thing in the creative conference. So that's something, you know, we live in a city in Atlanta that is 50% African American, and our crews and our content doesn't reach that. So,
yeah,
you know, I see that in the classes that I teach and the events that we have through the festival, but it's something that's important to us because we see the disconnect.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so that's one thing I really like, and that's one reason why I was attracted to this conversation is because of the kind of stories that you make sure the American people have access to and the importance of that.
Definitely. Yeah. And I should also mention that when we say diversity, or as I've been talking about it, we're looking at a wide range of factors, I should say. And so disability can be part of that, sexual orientation or gender identity, regional diversity, socioeconomic diversity. So all of that we're considering when we're talking about diversity. It's not specifically race or gender. It can be and you know, so much of what we do is intersectional as well. And so we're looking at all of it and making sure that the stories that we're telling is representative of the makeup of our country in many ways.
That's fantastic. Anything else you can think of? I feel like we've covered so many things. Well, I'm looking at like some of the things that you've worked on. PBS's Breaking Big, Take on America, Girls Incarcerated, True Life Biography, Trading Spaces, you know, Miami Inc. You worked on Obama for America, Hillary Clinton, DNC. So you've had quite the successful career and everything that you've done. Like, what is the favorite thing that you've worked on and why?
Let's see. Well, I should say beyond ITVS.
Yeah, pre-TV. I'll ask you that one in a
Pre-ITVS,
second, but pre-ITVS.
yeah. I really loved working on the biography series, which was, A&E biography, and then they actually had a spin-off channel that was the biography channel back when, again, basic cable was doing a lot of niche programming. And so I really just loved telling those stories, biographies of people, and trying to also figure out different ways of telling their stories beyond just the chronological and finding themes throughout their lives. And so, and not dissimilar from what American Masters is doing on PBS and some of our films, the films that we're supporting that are going into their series. So that was one of my favorites. And,
yeah.
yeah.
So since you've been at ITVS, is there one or a couple projects that are things that you are most proud of?
Yeah, I would say in my time at ITVS, probably working with the Philly DA team was just one of my favorite hands-on experiences. Like they just came in with such an incredible project. This is again a docu-series. It was an 8-part docu-series about Larry Krasner, who's the district attorney of Philadelphia, sort of a progressive DA coming in to take a different stance on mass incarceration and probation and how certain laws impact disadvantaged communities. And so, but also facing a lot of resistance from the police union and community members. And so he's, it's a fascinating story. I believe he's still in office, and it's also is happening throughout the country. Some of these progressive DAs, some of who have been removed because the communities weren't happy with their policies or how they were, what their perspective was. But the film team was just incredible and had incredible access and really told a beautiful, beautiful 8-part series in such a masterful way. And was really proud to work with them. But it was really their vision and their talent that made that series great.
Yeah. So that leads me to maybe a question I shouldn't ask, but I'm curious. Well, because, as for that example, so, I believe there's a lot of problems with policing and there's things that we can fix and do better. But the idea that no one sits in jail when they, commit a crime is not really necessarily a great idea. And some people, that's the impression sometimes and not actual policy.
Sure.
There's a lot, and I use that as an example because, I've gotten into arguments with my less progressive friends about PBS. And they feel like PBS is very progressive. And I think it is because they're moving forward and representing everyone and not just one segment of thought that some people may construe that as being hostile. Like I see my friends like, oh, Facebook hid this post. They must hate Christian. No, it looks like I had a mountainscape, cut out. Well, why? Maybe it looked indecent. I don't know why a picture of a mountain got, things get lost in an algorithm sometimes.
Yeah.
Not everything is a conspiracy theory, but a lot of people feel like, well, why should my money go to PBS? Why should these stories be told? This is all about, progressive ideas. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but I imagine that you hear that. How would you combat that idea that you aren't necessarily out just telling one side of the story?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. We can also talk about disinformation and the other sort of challenges that are happening with the media landscape. But specifically with the work that we do, I should even say with Philly DA, it wasn't all like, here's Larry Krasner, he's an amazing human being. This was a very hard look at what he was doing. The filmmakers didn't take a stance to say, he's great. And there was a lot of criticism within the show about what he was doing, and they were really trying to show the full scope of what he was going through, and both the folks who were with him and the folks who were against him. And so, and we as ITVS are not a progressive organization. We support filmmakers of all perspectives, and that's really our mission. So it's not about us, it's about them. It's about the independent filmmaker and their point of view. And so I just wanted to make that clear that we are not pushing any sort of agenda. That is also why we're very conscious of who's giving money, who has editorial influence, and making sure that it's not from an advocacy organization or activist, whether they're on the right or left side of the aisle. And then PBS in general, PBS is one of, if not the most trusted institutions in America consistently, in surveys and polling. And that's because they are fair and balanced in the true sense of the word, the words, and they have the highest editorial standards. They really do. It's actually, filmmakers come to us and after working maybe with some commercial outlets and are surprised by how rigorous fact checking and the standards and practices of public media are. And I think that's a good thing. PBS and public media is supported by both sides of the aisle. PBS is not just this large, amorphous organization, sitting in Washington, D.C. They're actually, PBS is made up of a constellation of local stations in almost every community in America. And so those stations are integral to each of those local communities and are supported by politicians on both again, left and right, Republican, Democrat. They have strong support. And so every once in a while, you might hear that we want to defund PBS or public media, or they're too progressive, but actually they have bipartisan support in local communities where really where the action is, so to speak. So I would say that the fairness in both editorial and the perspectives that are told is paramount, and the editorial standards are top notch. And it really isn't in any sense of the word like a left-leaning organization.
Yeah, personally, I love PBS. I spend a lot of time driving, so I'm always listening to
Yeah.
PBS or Public Radio Remix. That's one of my favorites. So I get to hear lots of different stories, things I never, this is what I think I love about documentaries
Mhm.
is you're learning things you never thought you'd be interested in learning.
Yeah.
I hear a story about some obscure human doing some obscure thing, which I didn't know existed and didn't care about. And then I'll hear the story and now I'm fascinated with this thing and this person, and that this is a part of culture in a part of the states that we don't see. I think people forget how big our country is.
Yeah. And I think that,
and how different all of the different places are. I mean, it's a huge amalgamation of a lot of different kinds of people. And I love that PBS gives us a glimpse into all different kinds of lifestyles.
definitely. And I think, you mentioned the algorithm earlier, and that's the problem when we're constantly being fed what we think we want and based on what we've watched before, versus, to your point, discovering something that you didn't think you wanted or didn't even think existed, and being better for it. And so I really, however this all shakes out in terms of, streaming and algorithms and technology, I hope there's still that space for people to discover new things that they didn't know that they cared about or wished for. And that really is the beauty of it and the power of documentary, the power to bring people together and to create more empathy, to create knowledge about folks and communities and areas that you didn't know anything about. And I think we need that more than ever right now. We're so polarized, and both in terms of this country, and obviously there's conflict all over the world, but just that shared understanding and shared humanity is part of what documentary does so well. And yeah.
And that sounds like a perfect way to end things. Is there, I think we've covered everything.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this.
Yeah, this was fantastic. And thank you. And it's nice to hear all the new things that you guys are looking at and experimenting with. I go to TikTok because I get, I try to mess with the algorithm so I don't get and end up on the dark side.
Yeah.
But that's one of the places where I find things I didn't know anything about. I feel like I learned so much from that platform, and being able to take short form documentary stories into that platform, I think is a great way to continue that storytelling. So I look forward to seeing how this experiment goes and hope it's successful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And I think that's we don't try to fight what's happening in terms of audience trends and technology. It's like, but how can we be a part of it and make it better, hopefully? So,
That's great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Thank you all for tuning into the Creative Conference. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. Please tune in for more conversations virtually and go in the room. Go to our YouTube channel to look up the last few years worth of conversations as well. And thank you again for your time, and we'll speak again soon.
Sure. And if I can make one quick
Yes,
plug, just for
absolutely.
filmmakers who want funding, our website, ITVS.org, ITVS.org, has all of our funding information. It says when our calls are for filmmakers to apply. You can subscribe to our newsletter, which also keeps you up to date on our funding opportunities. And we are often out in the field at film festivals, so please come find us and we can tell you more about how to get funded.
Excellent. Thank you. And I will sign up for your newsletter.
All right. Sounds good.
All right.
Thank
Thank you
you so
so
much.
much.
All right.
Bye-bye, Ray.
Goodbye.